All right, looking at number 2, when it says to find is f of x and g of x inverses of each other, we're going to work it out using our notes and our strategy from yesterday of just knowing inverse. On Monday, I'll show you a different way to work these out as well. So all we're going to do is choose one of the two functions and calculate the inverse from it. So let's choose f of x, and it equals negative 3x minus 2. So what we want to find is the inverse of f of x and see if that's going to be the g of x function. So our first step here is we'll write it as y equals negative 3x minus 2. Remember, now we're going to change our y to x and our x to y to calculate out the inverse. We'll add 2 to the other side. And then we have x plus 2 equals negative 3y. And remember, negative 2 plus 2 gives you a plus 0. So because of the plus 0, we're able to not have that term anymore because negative 3y plus 0 is just negative 3y. Dividing by negative 3 on both sides. Then we have x plus 2 divided by negative 3 equals y. And remember here that when you have negative 3y divided by negative 3, a negative 3 divided by a negative 3 gives you 1y, and we just write that as y. That's the mathematical reasoning to dividing by a negative 3. We want to bring our negative sign out of the denominator and up to the numerator. So remember, all that's really going to do is change the signs of our numerator. So we'll have negative x minus 2 all divided by 3 equals y. So all I'm going to do is write this up top here so that we can see what the inverse was and compare it to our b. So if our inverse is negative x minus 2 over 3, that is not what we have here for g, so g is not the inverse of f. Now, when we look at a problem like number 9, we could do something on number 9 by using test-taking skills, since we haven't talked about the graphing yet. If we take our problem, if we notice, the problem gives us the graph as well as the inverse answers. So because the problem gives us both, knowing how to calculate the inverse, you could just match it to the inverse equation and answer the question without even having to use the graph. So what we're going to do first is we're going to work the problem out, match it to the inverse equation. Then we're going to take the graph of the inverse and explain why that graph is the inverse. So the first thing we need to do is we need to calculate the inverse for number 9 algebraically and find out which one of these is our answer. So go ahead and do that, and then we'll check our work. So remember, on number 9, we'll change the f of x to y, and then we're going to switch x and y, correct? So by doing that, we'll have x equals negative 2y minus 2. Oops. I wrote the x down twice. X equals negative 2y minus 2. Again, we need to add 2. And we're going to have x plus 2 equals negative 2y. Next, we're going to divide each side by negative 2. Remember, you're going to divide x plus 2 all by negative 2. And then we have x plus 2 divided by negative 2 equals y. I'm going to just rewrite the y on the left-hand side. Again, we're going to bring the negative up to the top. So it's going to switch the signs of our terms in our numerator. So it's going to become a negative x now and a minus 2, all divided by 2. One thing I want to point out here is that we can always break up our fraction into the two terms, right? We can take the 2 and write it underneath each term. Now, when we work it out and we break up our 2 into each term for the denominator, remember there will be a 1 with that x. That would be negative 1x. So we can write this as negative 1/2 x minus 2 divided by 2 is 1. Some answer keys, just to highlight, could switch the spots of these two terms. So it could read negative 1 minus 1/2 x. So an answer key could have any of these three choices as the correct answer, depending on how the answer key is written in multiple choice form. Now, if we compare our work to number 9 to what we have over here for our answers for number 9, if we notice that letter choice D is written the same for our inverse. It says negative 1 minus 1/2 x. And that's what we have. Okay. So yes, we could have worked out this problem without even looking at the graph. But now let's look at figuring out why the graph for letter choice D is an inverse. So first thing we want to do is let's go ahead and label out the points for our blue linear line and our green linear line, and then we're going to compare the coordinates just like we talked about yesterday in our notes to talk about the inverse. All right, let's label out the coordinates for the blue linear line. So the top coordinate up here, negative 4 on the x and 6 on the y. Next coordinate would be negative 2, 2, correct? And then for the coordinate, we would have 0 on the x and negative 2 on the y. And then the final coordinate at the bottom would be 2 and negative 6. Looking at the green linear line, x is negative 6, y is 2. We would have an x of negative 2 and a y of 0. Next coordinate moving to our right, we'd have 2 and negative 2. And the final coordinate would be 6 and negative 4. When we introduced the notes yesterday, we talked about looking at an inverse. And when we talked about an inverse, we talked about switch the x and y, correct? So if we look for the inverse, then if there's an inverse coordinate, then I would have to have 6, 4, correct? And I have the coordinate on the green for 6, 4. The next coordinate down, the inverse of negative 2, 2 would be 2, negative 2. 0, negative 2, the inverse would be negative 2, 0. And 2, negative 6, the inverse, switching the x and y, would then give us negative 6 and 2. So the graph are inverses of each other because the coordinates are flip-flopped. Okay. Let's look at number 7 and 8. 7 and 8 look a little bit different because we haven't talked about a problem where our parentheses is cubed or where we have in number 8 the cube root. The opposite operation of a parentheses cubed is taking the cube root. The cube root and something cubed cancel each other out. Going backwards of that, then if we have the cube root, if we raise it to the third power and cube it, likewise, they cancel each other out. The only thing to make sure you pay attention to here is you only can have a parenthesis, just that one term cubed, or just the square root. Don't have plus or minus signs underneath here still. So you work out number 7, and then we'll check our work in a second. I'm going to hit record. All right, let's work through number 7 and check your work. So I'm going to switch my X and Y's. And then I'm going to solve my problem. Remember, when I solve, I want this parentheses cubed by itself. So I need to make the 2 go away. By subtracting it, I get a 0 on this side. So 2 minus 2 is 0. So all I'm left with is the y minus 2 cubed. And then x minus 2. I'm going to rewrite this so that you can see the next step a little bit easier. On each side, I need to take the cube root and the cube cancel each other out. So now I only have y minus 2. And on the left-hand side, I'm going to have the cube root of x minus 2. Like we subtracted the 2 up above to get rid of the minus 2 next to the y, we're going to add the 2 to both sides. So then I have 2 plus the cube root of x minus 2 equals y. We notice we have something similar to that in letter C. What they did in letter C was they took the 2, the way we wrote it, and all they did was put the 2 on the other side. So they just switched the order. So they wrote it as the cube root of x minus 2 plus 2. So let's look at number 8. What are you going to do when you have the cube root there? Remember, we need to do what to get rid of that cube root? Go ahead and do your work, and then we'll check it. All right, let's look at working out number 8. I'm going to change the y to an x, change the x to a y, and now I'm just going to solve for y. I need to add 2 to both sides. So now I have x plus 2 equals the cube root of y minus 3. I need to get y out from underneath the cube root. In order to do that, we're going to cube both sides. The cube root and the cube cancel each other out, so now y minus 3 is now not underneath the cube root, and we have x plus 2 cubed. We need to add 3 to both sides, so we have x plus 2 cubed plus 3 equals y. And if we notice, that's going to be letter choice B.